Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. Today, I am so excited to talk about Jodi Picoult's By Any Other Name. I am going to admit that this book was recommended to me back in December, maybe November, by my therapist. My therapist is also actually a prescribing psychiatrist, which is very helpful. I think it's funny that everybody is like, oh, I'm on a very low dose of Lexapro, or I'm on a very low dose of, Prozac, or whatever it is. I'll tell you, people, I'm on a whopping dose of Wellbutrin, and I tell you, it's really working for me, and I'm really, really grateful for all sorts of psychopharmacology. And it's not very often that she recommends books to me. We have much bigger fish to fry. I can't remember exactly what she said about it in the winter, but it was not something that convinced me to dash out and get the book. But then she mentioned that it was about two women who were writing under pseudonyms, which is interesting to me, centuries apart. But the thing that really got me was the idea that one of them was supposedly writing the works of Shakespeare. Those of you who have tuned into the Foxed Page recently know that I just did a deep dive into Don Quixote. This is all under my intention these days of using literature as an escape. I've mentioned before that I believe literature can do all sorts of things. It can edify, inspire, convince, and it can definitely allow for an escape, which is what I have been needing these days. Don Quixote provided the perfect escape because it is obviously talking about a chivalric knight in Spain from the beginning of the 17th century. So Don Quixote was published between there are two volumes. So the first in 1605, the second in 1615, and Macbeth was published 1606, 1607, so right after Don Quixote. And I love thinking about Cervantes and Shakespeare as these kind of compatriots, actually totally not compatriots, but as contemporaries. And I love Shakespeare. I love deep diving into Shakespeare. I mean, I'm not one of these people who's dying to go sit through, 3-hour productions all the time. In fact, I have been known to go to the first act and then, at that first intermission, be like, I've got it. I'm really into it. I'm feeling the mood, and that is really all I need. I do love reading the plays because they do oftentimes feel like a sort of puzzle that I enjoy having to work a bit to put together. But I have always been interested in this question of authorship of all of those incredible plays by Shakespeare. So when I realized that By Any Other Name was playing with that concept, I was sold. I had gone, of course, straight down to my local bookstore and was also totally taken by the cover. Anybody on YouTube can see this gorgeous cover. I love not only the floral feel of it, but I also like the way that these flowers are obscuring the face of this woman, which seems very important. Also, of course, we have Jodi Picoult in these giant letters, because whenever people buy volumes by Jodi Picoult, it is really that author that we are purchasing as much as anything else. Whenever the author's name is huge and the title is small, you know that that's someone who's got like a full stable of books. I also really loved the title. By Any Other Name, of course, is a reference to Shakespeare, but it becomes so relevant throughout the story in ways that I really enjoyed. So for those of you who like an agenda, here's what we're going to be doing today. Briefest of bios, we're going to just touch on Jodi Picoult very quickly. We're then going to talk about the nature of historical fiction. I'm very ambivalent about historical fiction. I really enjoy it when it is good, but I'm very, very picky about it because many times I feel like it can be kind of contrived and belabored, which is not something that I'm ever looking for in fiction. We're then going to talk about the structure of the book, because this is not just a straightforward historical fiction novel. It is one that resides both in the 17th century and then also in the 21st. We're going to talk a little bit about the narrative stance of the book. It's kind of a piece with the structure, but it's very important and very well done. We're then going to talk about pacing. Pacing is simply the sort of speed and the manner in which an author is meting out information, and Picoult does such a good job with it. It's one of the reasons I think why the old story, the backstory, the Amelia Bassano story, works so well in this book. We're going to talk a tiny bit about plot. I'm never one who's really reading a lot for plot, but I really enjoyed some of the elements here. I thought were very clever, very well done, and felt very organic, which is what you want, while also really propelling the narrative forward. We're going to then talk about the prose. She's such a good writer. There's really a lot to be said, and we're going to sort of dig in a little bit to why the prose is so strong, and then we're going to end with some quibbles. These are just a couple of things that started sort of distracting me a little bit from the strength of this book, and so I just want to touch on them very briefly. I find sometimes that when I start talking about quibbles, usually at the very end of a lecture, one of the things that discussing those sort of less strong aspects of the book, one of those things it does is actually really elevate the things that are working well. So we're going to end up with some quibbles. Okay, very briefest of bios of Jodi Picoult. She was born in 1966. She's 58 years old. She's written 30 novels, and she has sold 40 million copies. That is an enormous, enormous number of books. I wrote a book literally in another lifetime, it feels like, and my print run was 7,000 copies, and I was actually very pleased that that whole print run sold out. They did not, in fact, renew it after the 7,000. But a 7,000 copy print run is actually pretty, I felt pretty good about that. She has literally sold 40 million copies of books. That is the kind of number that I have a hard time even conceiving of. She's obviously very successful. And I would argue that she is successful in part because the prose is very strong. But this is someone who really knows how to write a novel. She's got the pacing, the characterization, the breadth, all of those things are so strong. She's also someone who is not afraid to talk about controversial things. I've actually only read one other book by her, which is My Sister's Keeper, which I can picture the cover of it in my mind, but I absolutely cannot remember what it was about. I remember really enjoying it, and I'm not quite sure why I haven't read another one for decades. But she has someone who has really tackled a lot of very big issues and very controversial topics in ways that I think is really laudable. Those of you on YouTube might notice that I have these kind of tails that are sticking out of the sleeves of my sweater. This is yet another sweater that I have just finished. And for those of you on the podcast, you cannot see that this is actually one of those like quarter zip sweaters, which I think is funny because it's almost always halfway down. I had never put a zipper in a sweater before. And honestly, I think this thing is so pro. Like it looks so much like I purchased it. I mean, not to be totally self-aggrandizing, but it really truly does. That I think the only giveaway here, for those of you who are on the YouTube, is the fact that I have yet to sew in all of the ends. I hadn't quite gotten to that, but really wanted to don it for today's lecture. Okay, we're going to dive into this notion of historical fiction, and I want to give a few sort of broader thoughts about the genre. When you sort of think about it, it becomes very apparent what an author has to do. They have to create a sense of place that is really very consistent and very vivid, has a lot of verisimilitude, which simply means that as a reader, you feel like the world that you are in is very consistent and vivid and true and doesn't have any sort of like crazy anachronistic elements. So they have to create this sense of place. They also, of course, have to create characters who fit well in that sense of place. And there's a whole tone that has to go with it. I mean, it doesn't have to. You can write historical fiction in a tone that is very like 21st century, but often writers, especially if they're including dialogue, are going to have to really sort of parrot the language of the time. And that's an awfully large goal for any author to attain. I mean, those are a lot of different elements, any one of which is difficult to attain, but to put them all together and have it function really well is very difficult. And for many of you, this may not be totally conscious, but sometimes when we're reading, if something doesn't feel quite like it fits in, or if someone's tone is a little off, the reader is taken out of the novel. Like there's this kind of little part of you that's like, wait, that doesn't seem quite in tone with the rest of what I'm reading. Or like you think, oh, wait, I never pictured that guy as someone who was like a big fan of sushi, whatever the thing is. But if there comes a moment where you're sort of pulled out of the narrative, as soon as that happens, the author has lost the reader. It's very difficult to do this, and Jodi Picoult does such a good job of it. I would argue, in fact, in this novel, that the Elizabethan era, the Amelia stories, are a little more convincing than the Melina stories. One of the things that historical fiction does that I think is so great, I these days keep seeing lots and lots of historical fiction by women, and I think that is no coincidence. I think part of the reason why women write historical fiction is because when we read history texts, it's often, dates and battles and the commodities that are being produced and different monarchies, that kind of thing. And the lives of women are often not included. So a lot of what is happening with historical fiction that I like is the insertion of women and the domestic sphere into a historical era. So we may know a lot about, what is happening with the English monarchy, at the beginning of the 17th century. I personally do not. I mean, I kind of do. Elizabeth I, for to situate everybody out there, was the way I think of it is Elizabeth I was sort of 1550 to 1600. And then Victoria is kind of, 1850 to 1900. So you have the Elizabethan era and the Victorian era. In my mind, those are sort of well delineated just because the dates are actually very handy. And a lot of literature, there's this enormous literary moment that was happening during the Elizabethan period and immediately after, when James comes to power during the Jacobean period. And then, of course, during the Victorian era, there's lots of literature. The novel is really coming into its own, really for the first time since Don Quixote. If you want some thoughts on the novel, go back and listen to that lecture. But the novel's really coming into its own between 1850 and 1900. Soon after that, we have modernism and all of the stuff that happens in the beginning of the 20th century. But back to my point here, which is that we know all of these different things about the monarchy, and in fact, we don't know much about Shakespeare's life, but we can imagine a lot of it, in part because of the plays, but also because a lot of research has been done. There are tons and tons of books about what Shakespeare's life might have been. And some of those really dive into the lives of women, but not in the way that historical fiction can. It can really, really make those periods come to life in a way that's incredibly valuable. And one of the things I like best about this book is Picoult is really sort of straddling this line between a lot of the sort of very male things that we know. We're talking about Kit Marlowe, we're talking about Shakespeare, we're talking about what it's like to be a playwright in that era, which was a very male endeavor. And we're getting a really good sense of what that's all about. We're getting a very good sense of Amelia Bassano's man who is in court and who is in charge of literature. They're really beautiful depictions of what his job is all about. But what I'm really interested in, of course, is the way that Amelia herself is bringing to life this entire world that we don't get when we are studying history. So one of the major pitfalls that I find personally in historical fiction, of course, if something is anachronistic, that drives me insane. The minute something is sort of obviously incorrect, in the sense that if we're talking about the 16th century and then someone's mentioning, like the extreme would be like an automobile or something, if there's something that's truly actually not part of the time, that just feels very sloppy and you're obviously pulled out of the narrative. But it's very difficult to keep in tone and keep in voice and keep in the world. But I would argue again that she does that very well. And a couple of the pitfalls that come with all sorts of historical fiction is the idea of something being a little bit contrived. So if we have a sudden passage here and our character, who is a musician in the court, is suddenly talking about the way that traffic works in London, you're sort of like, wait, why is this musician in court talking about traffic in London? That's not an example from this book. I'm trying to sort of contrive one for you. If it feels like something is being created just to get information across to the reader, then the author has failed a little bit. The information in historical fiction has to be organic. It has to be within the realm of a character. It's very, very difficult. So occasionally you'll be reading along in historical fiction and something will feel a little too convenient. Suddenly, that person will make a foray out somewhere where they have no reason to be going, and you get the feeling that it is simply in order to give us the sense of that place into which they are foraying. Sometimes, too, historical fiction can feel very sort of didactic or sort of pedantic. You get the sense that, suddenly we are hearing a little bit of capital H history. And I think Jodi Picoult, it was so interesting, and we're going to actually look at a couple of examples of this. There were times when I was in my marginalia, I wrote too convenient or contrived, but then I found myself very interested in it. So usually when something is contrived like that, it's not great. But in the hands of Jodi Picoult, it actually worked fairly well. So I want to take a look at a few of her strengths. We're going to just read a couple of quick passages, one of which is on page 112 and 113. So this is 112 and 113. We're, relatively close to the beginning of this book. It's 480-something pages long. This is one of the Amelia sections. So one thing that happened as I was preparing the lecture is I realized that all of the examples that I was taking out to show you how strong Picoult's writing is, almost all of them came from the Amelia chapters. And I think in part that's because that's sort of the more true historical fiction, and that's where my focus was. But also I really do, I sort of vote for the fact that they work well together, certainly, and I liked the Melina section, but I did find the Amelia section much stronger. So we're going to take a look at pages 112 and 113 to get a sense of why Picoult's historical fiction works as well as it does. We're going to read this first paragraph. As Amelia grew older, she understood what it was like to no longer fit inside your own body. Her legs lengthened, her breasts ripened, she grew into her enormous gray eyes and plush mouth. Those changes were noted by Hunsdon, by courtiers who lost the thread of whatever conversation they were having when she passed, by noblewomen who glanced at her with jealousy. but nobody seemed to realize that Amelia's mind was also growing. She would stand on the balcony of her bedroom staring up at Tycho Brahe's inconstant stars and wonder how much of the world had to change before you felt the shift in the universe. So there are a couple of things that I want to touch on here briefly. And maybe the most salient here is this kind of tone. It is so good because it's very, very subtle what Picoult is doing with tone. And I think you can understand what I mean by tone, but it comes from word choice, it comes from syntax, it comes from, the way that the sentences are constructed. It's different in the Melina stories, in which the narrator's voice, the novel is in third person, both in the past and in the present stories. So you have this third person narrator speaking in tones that are different in the front and the back. And when it is in the back, when it's in the Amelia stories, it is very subtle, but it is really great. Things like, as Amelia grew older, even that kind of phrasing, grew older, feels just a tiny bit antiquated. We might say as she grew up, we might say as she got older. This idea of as she grew older is a tiny bit formal and a tiny bit archaic. And then we follow, she understood what it was like to no longer fit inside your own body. To no longer do something is also a little bit antiquated. We might say, she didn't quite fit in her body anymore. Not quite. That actually also seems a little antiquated. But this idea of some of these phrases do feel a little bit archaic. Then this idea of her having grown into her plush mouth, that there are some words that she is using that are entirely, used these days, but not so much in this kind of description. And the idea of a plush mouth, there's something about that does feel kind of old-fashioned. I think even the idea of just describing someone's face, it sounds like you're describing a portrait or something. We are not getting that kind of description with Melina so much, except we know they have the same color eyes, which is important because, of course, they are related. We also have, the next phrase is, those changes were noted. So the idea of noted, it wasn't that these people noticed, blah, blah, blah. It was that the changes were noted. And then we have an M dash, my favorite punctuation mark. It's that kind of long dash between words. It connects the two of them. And it says, by Hunsden, by courtiers who lost the thread, blah, blah, blah. So Hunsden and courtiers, even the names, like evoking the names of people, because they are names that are, Hunsden sounds, in fact, to me very much like a lord of the court in the Elizabethan era. And then, of course, the word courtiers. So there's vocabulary that also is really immersing us in that era, which is also important. A little bit further, we have the mention of Tycho Brahe. So this is someone who, at one point, she is looking at the stars with him. First of all, his name is unusual, and it's actually one that I recognized. I don't know exactly why I recognized it. I feel like, was it in I can't remember where I'm remembering it from, but it was, in fact, I remember thinking, I don't think that's how I thought the last name was spelled. This is why it sort of dawned on me that I had heard this name before. But the idea of Tycho Brahe's inconstant stars, that's a very antiquated way to think about the stars, and the idea of inconstant in general, that's a word that we, in fact, don't use very often anymore. So it's very subtle. It feels like, it's not like suddenly we're speaking in Old English, but there is a shift from the more modern language in the Melina chapters, and it is so well done. And I want to just pop right across the page to 113. So this is a study less of tone and a little more of scope. So one of the things historical fiction has to do, sometimes, I just read that incredible book, You Dreamed of Empires, by Alvaro Enrique, which is about the day of first contact between Montezuma and Cortez. It's a very narrow time frame. The author is talking about essentially one afternoon. That is not what's happening with Amelia here in By Any Other Name. In fact, we're looking at her over the course of decades. So you can't have you can't focus, on every single day, obviously, in all of those decades, but we have very close attention paid to, 1 or 2 days or 1 or 2 afternoons. And then we have this beautiful bridging with writing that is both very specific and very engaging, but also is carrying us across wide swaths of ideas and swaths of time. So on 113, the writing is so fun to go back and look at. Just note as I'm reading this, all of those beautiful elements of word choice and tone and vocabulary, but also the breadth of the passage. In public, Amelia played the part of a decorative object. In private, when she felt too full at the seams of her own life, she spilled all that emotion, intelligence, and hope onto pages and pages of poetry, fables, and snippets of dialogue. Amelia wrote from the point of view of the bird of prey, delighting in those few moments of freedom before the jesses were pulled. She wrote fairy tales about princesses who climbed down brick towers, rescuing themselves. She wrote female characters who were adored for both their minds and their beauty. She wrote witty banter with men who were not afraid of a woman who could think for herself. She wrote of what sex must be like when your soul was as invested as your skin. She wrote love poems where sometimes love was fire, sometimes it was rote, and sometimes it was agony. So I loved this. I mean, the book is entirely feminist. At the very beginning, the dedication is like to fierce women. They're sort of adopted daughters, I think she mentions. I don't think she means like actually her adopted daughters, but these are sort of daughters who are very close to her. And she says the most important thing is that they are fierce women. So from the dedication, from the very beginning, we know that this is a book that is going to elevate strong women. And it does it so well. Usually I talk about whether we can consider a book feminist. This one, I'm not even going to talk about it in the lecture because it is so thoroughly a feminist novel. And honestly, there were times where I felt like we were hitting ourselves over, where we were getting a little hit over the head by some of the feminist stuff. But most of the time it was very welcome because, of course, it is not that clear in other pieces, especially writing that has to do with history. So one of the things I want to point out here, aside from the breadth, so we're talking about her writing, and presumably it's over many, many years because she's talking about all of these different things that she would be writing. There are a couple of notes too here. I loved throughout the book when she would mention a word that I did not understand. So the idea of Amelia wrote from the point of view of the bird of prey, delighting in the few moments of freedom before the jesses were pulled. So I don't know what a jess is. I actually tried to kind of figure it out. I'm like, if they're free before the jesses are pulled, I can't even conceive really of what a jess is, and I liked that. So part of successful historical fiction for me is a little bit of mystery. I mean, this is an era that we should not be able to sort of picture every single thing and understand every single thing. A lot of the words that I did not know were articles of clothing. And that was actually great because a lot of those I could sort of, by context clues, I could figure out what she's talking about. Although the whole time when she would talk about her kirtle, in my mind I was like, oh, maybe kirtle becomes the word skirt. Maybe it's kind of like a skirt of some sort. But then she talked about like the top part of her kirtle or the bodice of the kirtle. And I was like, whoop, apparently what I was thinking is not, in fact, the case. But I like the idea of a certain amount of mystery, especially when, we don't have to picture exactly what her clothing is all about, but there are other elements where there are other vocabulary words that I don't recognize that are very satisfying. I also like the scope of this passage in the sense that Jodi Picoult at the beginning, we're at sort of a quarter of the way in, is nodding to the fact that she's going to rewrite fairy tales. She is rewriting history. The idea of a princess in a tower rescuing herself is this idea of having an alternate view of how these received stories actually play out. And, we have a lot of received stories about the genius of Shakespeare, and she's really turning that on end. I also really like the idea of the witty banter. Jodi Picoult does dialogue so well. We're going to look at that in a second. And that is one of the ways I think her historical fiction is so successful. If you can put dialogue into the mouth of characters and have it really ring true, that is a very difficult thing because then you are needing to lean on some sort of Old English, but Old English that is comprehensible to your reader. It's a very hard task, and I think she really does pull it off. I also like the nod here to sex because it is a book that has a lot to do with, with passion and with sex and with the idea of love of all sorts of different kinds. Amelia Bassano is a sex worker, and it's interesting to me how sort of respectful that trade feels in the novel. But I also like this nod to the fact that this historical fiction is going to really enter into not only the domestic sphere, but like into the bedroom from the perspective of a woman, which is really difficult to do and something, a lot of the historical fiction that we see from male writers is not obviously writing about sex from the perspective of a woman. So this is really revolutionary, and I like the fact that she's calling out all of the different things that this book is doing. We then have a very brief little paragraph that ends this section, and I really liked the way that this articulates the goal of historical fiction and talks about when it is successful, what it is doing. So we have that nice long chunk. Then we have actually one more sentence that says, she hid hundreds of pages under her mattress, which of course speaks to the fact that in her era, she was not able to use her voice, and that it really takes Melina later, in the world of the novel, to bring Amelia Bassano's life to the page and to the reader. So what we have here is, this last brief paragraph. She did not write happy endings. As any real poet knows, the best tales are the ones that contain a kernel of truth. I loved this because essentially what we are having here is a description of historical fiction, that the best tales are ones that are in fact true. I'm using air quotes because I just have a very hard time with the idea of truth. I mean, obviously there are, facts that we have that are provable. But whenever we're talking about truth in a novel, I get a little bit like, whose truth are we talking about? But this is a very good place to mention the fact that Jodi Picoult has all of these appendices in the back of the novel, all of the things that she has read about Amelia Bassano, lots of notes. Of course, she has all of that cool stuff where where the excerpts of both Amelia Bassano's work, but also Shakespeare's work, are incorporated into the chapters. So in that sense, it's really lovely the way that Picoult is saying, like, here's the truth, here's the historical texts that I was looking at when I was really coming up with this story. And it's so well researched. I mean, you really, really get the sense that Picoult is someone who's working very hard at the research. And that is made very clear by the afterword and by the notes and by the sort of bibliography at the end. I think it's maybe further reading or maybe bibliography. But this is someone who has taken a kernel of truth and spun it not only into an incredible story about the Elizabethan era, but also about, the trials and tribulations that are still being faced by women who are trying to get their voices heard in the 21st century. I want to take a very quick look at dialogue because, again, I think this is something that she does so well. So fairly early on in the book, on page 28, we have this interaction between a baron and a countess. So it says this: "The baron was in attendance too, although he wasn't happy about it. 'If Oxford is here,' he muttered, as they awaited to enter the crush of the great hall, 'I shall not be held responsible for my actions.' 'If Oxford is here,' the countess said with a laugh, 'I shall eat my fan.'" I loved this so much. I'm not even totally, I'm gonna dig into maybe why, in fact, I do. One of them is that the man is sort of disgruntled and whatnot, but then the woman really, she's kind of laughing at him. And it really feels like this countess kind of has the upper hand. And in this little exchange, she in fact has the last word. But there is something about, "If Oxford is here, I shall eat my fan." It gives us this incredible visual of the woman with the fan. We also have "I shall," which is a beautiful way to remind us that these people are speaking in English that is not the same as our English. It is an English, I mean, if they were really speaking in their kind of their own vernacular, it would actually be much more difficult to understand than what Picoult is giving us. But when she says, "I shall eat my fan," we have "I shall," which feels, very much like we are in the Elizabethan era. But then the idea of "I shall eat my fan," I don't even know why I think it's so clever and witty, but I just loved it. It's very evocative of the time, but also just the absurdity. And she's not getting kind of crass. It's a very evocative and clever and very in-tone line of dialogue that's spoken in this very confident way that I really liked. One of the other reasons why Picoult's historical fiction works so well is that she really does include like history, kind of capital H history. And what I liked best about this is it generally was stuff that was very recognizable to your average reader. I mean, I am not someone who was really paying a lot of attention. And it was called Western Civ back at Castellea at my all-girls high school, Western Civilization, which, I mean, honestly, if I were to go back and look at what we were studying and sort of the canon, the historical canon at that moment, I'm sure I would be horrified. But I just don't think I had the context in which to really understand these things. I understand history better now, in part because of literature. But here on 116, we have this excellent incorporation of history that could feel a little pedantic. It could feel a little bit like we're pulling out of the story and we're hearing this kind of historical nugget, but it doesn't feel like that because it's so beautifully incorporated. So on 116, we have this. "Amelia's fingers tightened on his. He was tired. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, had disrupted the relationship with the Scottish king, and Queen Elizabeth had Hunsdon running back and forth collecting information about King James's moves and intentions." So here we have the idea, and it's beautiful the way that it is, her protector, or her sort of, he's really like the person who is paying for her sexual favors, Hunsdon. Is it Hunsdon? I feel like I keep saying it wrong. Yeah, Hunsdon. It's so funny when you've read the book and you kind of have said it in your mind, but you haven't said it out loud ever. Felt like I needed to double check. But Hunsdon is so beautifully incorporated because we know him in relationship with Amelia, but on page 116, he is, after we're fairly clear about his role in court, and what he's up to with all of the, the one who's sort of deciding about what theater is going to be seen, and of course his relationship with Amelia. Then Picoult sets him into the wider scope, which is not just talking about Queen Elizabeth, but also talking about Mary, Queen of Scots, and King James, who is of course going to succeed Queen Elizabeth. So it's really excellent the way we are given the wider scope here. Then I had this very weird moment, not here at this point in the book, but somewhere else, where they were talking about Anne Boleyn being Queen Elizabeth's mother. And I was like, what? Is Anne Boleyn Queen Elizabeth's mother? And then I was like, oh my God, I cannot believe. I mean, I was sort of minorly obsessed with Anne Boleyn for a while there. And somehow I just really hadn't clocked the fact. I mean, I clocked it at the time, but I hadn't really absorbed the fact that she was Queen Elizabeth's. I mean, honestly, King Elizabeth is probably appropriate, but I hadn't really had that information sunk in. That was one of the few times I had to go to Wikipedia, and I was like, or even I just asked Siri probably, was Queen Elizabeth the daughter of Anne Boleyn? And sure enough, I mean, it was kind of a shocker. But all of that is to say that the incorporation of history here is very strong. Another aspect of the novel that makes the historical fiction so strong is the sense of place. So Jodi Picoult, it's very subtle and it feels appropriately sort of in the background, but we have beautiful descriptions not only of what the insides of houses were like and what the streets smelled like and what things looked like, when people were dying of the plague, but we also have mention of these places in London that still exist. I assume a lot of them still exist. And even if these exact things don't exist with these exact names, as the reader, you have a little bit of a sense of, I mean, it sounds to me like it either still exists or it's very like a lot of the things that still exist in London. So on 73, we have this beautiful description of the place where Amelia is living. Somerset House sported a 2-story stone facade on the Strand, and a walled courtyard behind backed up to the river. It looked like a palace because it had been one, the home of Queen Elizabeth, until she gifted it to Lord Hunsdon a few years earlier. So I love that. And what's best about it is we are not spending lots and lots of time on this. She's just talking about the 2-story stone facade and then the garden behind, which is, impressive. Of course, at that point, London was not nearly as congested. But I love that line about it looked like a palace because it used to be one. So I think most of us in our minds then have an image of a palace, which honestly is that absolutely miraculous thing that reading does. I mean, if someone says to you, the facade looked like a palace, each of us is going to sort of pull up the image of the palace that is the perfect palace for us. It's the one that is going to speak to grandeur and history and all of the things that she is trying to evoke. So I love this balance here between being specific in some ways, but not hitting us over the head with way, way too much detail. The last thing I will say about the real strengths of Picoult's historical fiction is when we finally do have someone like Shakespeare really take the stage, as it were. I mean, he's obviously the person in some ways who is the most known. I mean, I don't even think that's arguable. I think he is the most known character in this novel. And it is so interesting when he does appear. And I really, I sort of liked the way that he was villainized. Occasionally I was like, oh, really? Because I, along with everyone else, I have him elevated. I mean, that guy is on a pretty high pedestal for me. And it was very interesting to think about him as being, kind of a scoundrel and someone who's not responsible and someone who is not paying his taxes and is spending time in jail and someone who maybe should be home with his family. A lot of the time when we would see him, I had in mind Maggie O'Farrell's Hamnet, which is another incredible example of historical fiction. In some ways, it seemed to me like a little more serious historical fiction. I really need to dive into that with you all because it was so moving to me when I read it. In that case, we have the death of Shakespeare's son. And so in that case, Shakespeare is much more sympathetic because, in fact, it is such a tragic story. But I really thought, I mean, every time we see Kit Marlowe, every time we see Shakespeare, anytime we are at court, it's really kind of hardcore, and she has to really deliver on these historical figures, and she does it so well. So now that we've talked a bit about historical fiction and how well she does it, I want to talk about the structure of the novel. It was one of the reasons why, when my therapist mentioned it to me, I was drawn in. I like this idea. I like the way that when you have a story that is set in the present moment, and you also have a whole vein that is set in the past, the promise there is that the past is going to be relevant to the contemporary moment. I would argue that anyone who's writing about the past, they better hope that the story is relevant to the contemporary moment. But often you have these beautiful echoes and parallels in this kind of structure that make it just an absolute joy. And that is the case with By Any Other Name. But I will say it's a pretty tricky thing. It's very like high risk, high reward in my mind, because as your reader is toggling back and forth, you have to make both of these storylines equally compelling. And I will say, I've alluded to this as we have talked today, I was much more sort of drawn in and impressed by the Amelia chapters. And we would go back to the modern part with Melina, which many elements of the Melina story worked well for me. I liked her relationship with Andre. I liked her own sort of, travails. I liked the span and the fact that she was a playwright. All of that was very interesting to me. But I was definitely more taken by the Amelia chapters. So one of the things that I think Picoult does well, like in the very beginning, I was like, these are feeling imbalanced to me. And so I was always like, oh God, here we are back with Melina in like 2022 or whatever. But the way that she maneuvers that, and the reason it was sort of saved for me, is that a lot of the focus in these Melina chapters is Amelia. So there were ways that, like, even when I was in the present day, I was really, along with all of the characters, I was really focused on what was happening in the past. So I will also say, too, that some of the real plot drivers, we're going to look at this in a second, those were things that were happening in the present day. And it is not that often that I'm reading a book and I'm like, wow, I wonder what's going to happen with the blah, blah, blah. In this case, I was like, oh my God, is this play ever going to be, on the stage? And then I was like, oh my gosh, who is going to get, the credit for having written this play? And like, oh my gosh, is the dad going to die? And it was a book where I was very invested in plot and was actively wondering what was going to happen. And that was actually happening more in the front story. So, credit to the front story. But I stand by the fact that the Amelia chapters, I think, were really the lifeblood of the book. I would also argue that we don't have just the two strands. It's not just, Amelia in the 17th century and then Melina in the 21st century. We also have this play that Melina is writing, obviously. And I liked the way that it is typeset. Sometimes, if they have like emails or texts or whatever, and they're formatted differently, that doesn't really sit very well with me. But I really liked the way that the passages from the play that Melina is writing, they were, the typeset's different and the format was different. And it was really fun. I also, I have to say, really loved the fact that we only got one page each time. I had the craziest thing happen, and this is actually kind of embarrassing to me. I would be reading along in a section and I'd be like, I'm having crazy deja vu. I was like, didn't we already hear these words like verbatim? And it took me a while to realize that, finally I went back and looked at the play and she is pulling things verbatim from Melina's play. And I was like, wait, wow, I really feel like I've read these before, because in fact I had. So you have Melina's section and Amelia's section, but very skillfully, we have this third element, which is this play that is bridging the two. And of course, it is very, very apt that we have the play, because the whole notion of Shakespeare and the question of Shakespeare rests on the success of all of these plays that are still performed all of the time. And then we also have this giant question about women and Black men as, sort of not being able to publish plays still, in the 21st century. So it's really excellent that we have this play that is really underscoring important elements in both of the storylines. Of course, we also have the excellent thing, I think most of you remember that term, the play within the play. One example of it is Midsummer Night's Dream, where they're putting on a play inside the play. There are lots of this like play inside the play in Shakespeare. And those are very important because they're often revealing something that's really, that has a lot to do with whatever you're supposed to be taking in, or it's a way to sort of upend that. But the play within the play is a very important trope in Shakespeare. And so it's really beautiful that Picoult herself, who was a woman who is writing this best-selling work in the 21st century, she is essentially having a play within the novel here, which is really in some ways a testament to the fact that we have women now whose voices are being heard, and whose voices, in this case, Jodi Picoult's, are elevating the voices of other women, young, struggling female playwrights, and also 16th century sex workers who are also, in fact, are incredibly astute and accomplished writers. So the play within the play, it's not very many pages, but in fact, it's a very important element. So structurally, this book is really, it doesn't feel intricate because you have the nice, each chapter has the name of the woman and the era, but it is a really beautiful structure, and it has, again, it's high risk, high reward, and I think she really pulls it off. I'm going to move fairly quickly through two sections that I mentioned, the narrative stance and also the pacing, because I really want to get to I want to make sure we have enough time to talk about the prose and why the actual prose functions so well. So in terms of pacing, this is very difficult. In the case of Amelia, we have her story, which is essentially from 1579 all the way through 1645, and all of these different phases of her life. When you look at what we have learned, it's a huge, this is a woman who has had many sort of lifetimes and who has lived in many different realms. And Picoult has done an incredible job, again, of really focusing in on time and then describing large swaths of time. And it doesn't feel heavy-handed. In fact, you're sort of relieved. You're like, okay, we've moved well forward. That was very satisfying, but we're not going to learn about every day of her life. We also have kind of a broad span in Melina's life, 2013 to 27. We see her as a college student, and then, she sort of zips forward in time, and then we see her with Andre during that one sort of fateful time when the play about Amelia is really coming to the fore. So the pacing is so good. It's actually very difficult, and most people don't notice it because when it's done well, it feels seamless and organic, but it is something to point out because she's so good at it. The other thing is plot. So I imagine most of you have read the book. If you have not read the book, don't listen to this part because I'm going to spoil the plot. I don't know, maybe zip forward in the lecture a little bit here. But there were two sort of turns, two sort of twists that happened in the plot that were very effective in the sense that they were very intriguing to me, but also because they brought up these big, big questions. So, of course, one of them is that when the play is submitted, in fact, by Andre, it is under the pseudonym of a male. And that, to me, felt sort of like, okay, we've done this before. Lots of times women have written under a male pseudonym. That did not seem that extraordinary to me. But the turn was that, in fact, this play was going to do well because it was written by a black man. So we have this idea of identity politics, which they talk about quite a bit in the novel. And we realize how far we have not come from the era when Amelia Bossano, because she was a woman, not of great means, was unable to publish widely and get credit for her work. And then you have exact same situation happening in the 21st century, both in part from Melina, who is a woman, but we also have the introduction of a whole different person with Andre. This is a novel, and I think this is one of the reasons for Jodi Picoult's success. This is a novel that really kind of has something for everyone. Even with the dad, I didn't love that whole storyline, but there's this kind of thing about you've got the dad who is grieving the loss of his wife, and also you have this other woman who comes in. And so you're kind of working through this notion of what it is to have a father who's moving on. There's a lot of stuff that is in this novel that, again, sort of offers something for everyone. And the fact that Andre is gay is also, a part of the whole thing. But the fact that he is a black man raises all of these questions, these big, big questions that we have both in the past and in the present. And one of them is this idea of kind of the death of the author. So when I was in graduate school in the 90s and early aughts, there was, you would never talk about the sort of identity politics or the history or the biography of an author because you were really supposed to look at the text as this kind of discrete body that you were going to, really delve into. I've come away from that a bit. I really do think in many ways it's important to think who is telling this story? From what perspective are we hearing this? Not always. I think lots of times the identity of the writer really is not relevant at all, but sometimes it definitely is. And then it also brings this question of credit. It's interesting to me during my graduate studies, actually, when I would read something that was by, some anonymous person, there was a sense of I didn't value it quite as much as someone whose body of work I could really kind of dig into. And part of that, even though we weren't supposed to, was thinking about the biography of that person. Certainly, if it was someone who was writing against all odds, a good example of that is Sor Juana de la Cruz, who is a Mexican nun who did all of this incredible writing actually right around this same time. And that writing, the fact that she was who she was is extremely important in that writing. And it's very important to me that she was the one who got credit for it. So this idea that Melina is very explicitly, wrestling with is this question of, does it matter? Does it, was it more important for Amelia Bassano's writing to get out there, even, whether it's anonymous or whether it's under the name of Shakespeare? Is it important that she gets the credit? And I think the novel actually comes to a very nice conclusion about that. I'm going to let you discover that for yourself, maybe if you're not totally finished. It's also, I think, kind of obvious. But, even from the title of this book, By Any Other Name, that, of course, is referring to a rose. God, I didn't even check that. That's crazy. I think it's like a rose by any other name smells as sweet or something. So the title of the book is not, in fact, talking about the name of a person, when the book is very concerned with this idea of where do we give credit. This is also a concept that in the 21st century is so fascinating because of social media and because of how the internet functions. I mean, this question of like, who gets artistic credit for like a meme, for example, for something that someone creates and yet it is then recreated, or a lot of digital art. I mean, it's there are all sorts of things that are making that question very confusing in this day and age. Certainly in the age of AI. And I loved the timeliness of really thinking about, like, why is it important to give credit to people? It's a question, I think, that's highly debatable and interesting. So that was the first twist, was this idea that, they were going to produce the play because Andre was a Black man. The thing about like him writing in the voice of a woman, I was happy that Jodi Picoult was like, that happens all the time, which it does, and we don't really remark upon it. I did a lecture on Dolly Alderton's book where she is writing as a man, and that was something that confused so many people. I had a very astute reader who did not realize that Andy was a man because this person was assuming, because Dolly Alderton is a woman, that she would be writing in the voice of a woman. So the fact that a man is writing in the voice of a woman, that didn't seem that unusual to me. But the fact that a Black man was writing about this seemed like a very large plot point. And to be clear, like, why does the system care so much about whether or not the author is Black or white or male or female? The other sort of turn, the twist that the plot really, one of the things that really got me thinking was when Jasper's article went out. And I have to say that felt a little bit contrived too. Like, I just was like, what's the big rush for him to write this thing? And like how he's getting on the subway and he's like, there's all this kind of urgency. And then like suddenly this thing comes out the next day and it's this terrible lambasting of this thing that's opening up all of these other questions. And that's really a very large betrayal. That was one of these things where I was like, oh my God, how are things going to play out now? So all of that is to say that Jodi Picoult is so good at plot. I mean, there is a lot of questions about what's happening in Amelia's life, of course, the main one being whether or not she's going to be with her true love. But there were some very intricate plot points all along the way that were very compelling to me, those two being kind of the big ones. So now we're going to talk about why the prose itself works so well. And when I'm talking about prose here, I mean both, the narrator, what the narrator is saying. Oh, I forgot to touch on the narrator. I'm simply going to say that the narrator is a very skilled third-person narrator. But what it does is it closely aligns occasionally with other characters. So lots of times in the Melina section, we are just in Melina's point of view. And in Amelia's, we are in Amelia's point of view. But there are different times when we are in Jasper's point of view or someone else. So you have this flexibility in this third-person narrator. Sometimes it's omniscient. It's pulled way back. It's talking about things in very general terms. Sometimes it's a very close third in the sense that it is talking, revealing the thoughts and feelings of specific characters. So the nimble nature of that narrator is really great. And part of that is the prose. So I want to just very broadly, her use of details, the range that she has in this prose, which I've talked about, and also her humor. It's very difficult to write humor in general. And this was not a book that was like funny, but I really enjoyed some of the subtle humor and she pulled it off so well. So those are three elements sort of broadly that I think she does very well. But I want to look at more closely at a couple of more of kind of smaller elements. One is that the ending of her sections and the ending of her chapters are so strong. I mean, I have to say, I was really enjoying them, and then at some points they were getting a little cheese ball. And there was kind of a mix, but for the most part, I think the endings of the sections and chapters are excellent. And that's actually very important. When people talk about a page turner, it's really because when you get to the end of a section, something is happening, either in terms of plot or maybe in terms of prose, that really makes you want to keep reading. So a couple of those excellent section or chapter endings are the following. On page 35, we have, they're actually in Denmark at this point, in my homeland, and we have Amelia, who's very young and in court, and this is the first time that she's had her period. So we have this. Attends, Queen Sophie said, rising. Wait. In French, she asked Amelia her name. Amelia opened her mouth to answer and promptly fainted. So good. It was really, I love that as an ending. That was a section ending, but we have a really great chapter ending on 96. This is the ending of an Amelia section. I could do a better job than this man, she thought, but by the time she reached her chamber, she had already forgotten William Shakespeare's name. So good. So this is ironic, of course, because everyone knows William Shakespeare's name. This is actually an example of something called dramatic irony, which is where the reader has information that a character does not have. So we as readers know that William Shakespeare's name is going to be enormous, arguably, the biggest name in all of literature that is written in English. And it is excellent, the idea that she had already forgotten William Shakespeare's name. I love that ending, too, because it's echoing the big questions that are running throughout the book. On page 155, we have another excellent chapter ending. This is when the character Kit is together with Amelia. I really liked him as a character. We have this. Kit clinked his tankard of ale against hers. That's my girl. He flipped the Groatsworth pamphlet to its blank back and signaled for the barmaid again, this time to ask for a quill and ink. Now, he said, where will you start? I love that. Some of these chapter endings are just sort of sweet, but this idea of a beginning at the end of a section is very compelling because you're like, yeah, where is she going to start? Like, what is this writing that she's going to work on? So the endings of chapters and sections is so strong. So another thing that is so excellent about the prose throughout is the dialogue. I spoke earlier about how difficult it is to have, this historical aspect of the novel, the Amelia sections. To have a lot of dialogue there is difficult because the language needs to feel arcane and very sort of different that 21st century English sounds like. But it can't be too different either. It's kind of incomprehensible, or it's just like it just doesn't work very well. The other thing is that dialogue, I also mentioned that you shouldn't put exposition. There should not be background information. It shouldn't be like, here, I have arrived from England and I am happy to be welcomed in the Danish court. All of that information needs to be given to us in a different way. But some things that dialogue does need to do is it really needs to reveal a lot about a character or it needs to move the plot forward. And she does such a good job of both. And one of the things that happens in the Amelia chapter in particular is when we hear her voice, when Amelia herself is speaking, which is very important to hear her voice. When she is speaking in dialogue, she often says things that really speak to her strength as a person. So on page 30, this is, early in the novel, and she's very young at this point. And we have this moment where not only is she young, but she's also this is an interaction with a man who is a very commanding persona. So we have this. The man speaks first. You are Countess Bertie's ward, he said. She sensed that he knew more about Amelia than maybe she knew of herself. Which is so good. So this is a very good example. When we have good dialogue, part of it is having a good gloss. So the gloss is simply the words that are around the dialogue. In this case, the gloss is telling us something very important in a way that is very sort of poetic. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to repeat it. You are Countess Bertie's ward, he said. She sensed that he knew more about Amelia than she maybe knew of herself. So that's an important point, and it's not someone saying that to her. It's sort of included in their interaction, but it's really beautifully articulated in the gloss. So after she sensed that he knew more about Amelia than she maybe knew of herself, we have, straightening her spine, she met the stranger's gaze. If you tell Her Majesty I stepped out of the room, Amelia said, I shall tell her you were already out of it. So this is like so bold. And this is such a good example of her as just really having this nascent strength that is only going to grow and grow. She's also talking about Her Majesty. We're talking about her in court with this person who she essentially is kind of threatening in a way that I absolutely loved. So not only are we getting a sense of the court and feeling like we're in the presence of the queen, but we're also learning about her strength. On page 88, this is such a good example of how the dialogue can also really tell us so much about a minor character. The minor characters in this book are so well drawn. One of them is Hunsdon. You really do, he's kind of an old, gross dude, but you also, you have a lot of sympathy for him, and he does in many ways feel very sweet with Amelia. On page 88, we have this. Amelia felt her breath catch. I am sorry for my actions today, my lord. His expression softened. I know. With a sigh, he drew a line through a bit of dialogue. So I love this. I love also that it's mentioning dialogue. But when she says, I'm so sorry, and he says, I know, it's such a beautiful way to describe his beneficence and the way that he really cares for her. And it's unexpected, which really, deepens your understanding of who he is as a person. I also, again, love that idea of him writing through dialogue because it's as if he's trying to sort of erase the words that she has spoken. And it also has to do, of course, with his job. And it is underscoring, no pun intended, the fact that that everything we are reading is constructed out of words. And what they're talking about, these plays and the idea of who is writing them, all of that rests on words and words being either presented or being erased. So this beautiful sort of highlighting of the fact that people are controlling other people's language simply with this beautiful gloss where we have the action on the part of Hunsdon. Another element of the prose I think is so strong is her use of figurative language. So figurative language is just any language that is doing something other than what the words are denoting. So all those things you learned, in 10th grade, like, similes and metaphors and foreshadowing and symbolism, all of that kind of stuff. Mostly what she uses are similes and metaphors. They're basically the same thing. A simile uses like or as, and a metaphor does not. And I am very picky about figurative language. My thing is, like, if you're not good at it, if it's jarring and sort of too weird and your reader is drawn out of the flow of the work, just don't do it. There's some people who just seem to insist on all of these metaphors and similes, and I'm like, wow, no, thank you. And Jodi Picoult, honestly, I would say, like, definitely the majority, maybe the vast majority, are very strong. Then there's some that I'm like, oh gosh, no. So we're going to take a look at 52 at a metaphor that actually worked very well. This is one of the few times that we're dipping into the Melina sections. So here we are in the middle of the page. Melina sat on her bed while Andre detonated a small explosion in her closet. So I loved this, partly because, I literally will say, like, which unfortunately is often the case, I'm like, my bedroom looks like a bomb went off, because it's kind of an expression. She doesn't say the cliche thing, which is it looks like a bomb went off. Instead, she has actually language that's very different from what we are seeing in the Amelia chapter, the idea of detonating something. That's a very sort of modern term, I think. But the idea also of detonated a small explosion in her closet is excellent because it is kind of what would happen. I mean, it's obviously, the reason it's a metaphor is because he's not detonating an explosion in her closet, but it just speaks to, like, the explosivity of their relationship and the fact that he's very dynamic. Everything about it really appealed to me. And then a little further down, we have this thing that in a lesser writer's hand would have been really, like, a little overbearing and maybe kind of cheeseball and just, like, too contrived, but I really liked it. So we have him detonating the small explosion in the closet, and then down a little bit below, if I'm in the closet, he said, I might as well do something there. Which I loved that. I mean, obviously, he is referring to being a closeted gay man. He hasn't told his parents he is gay yet. And, you could argue that's a little bit heavy-handed, but I liked it. It worked. He is in the closet, and he's helping her out to, try to figure out how to look better. But I like I think part of the reason why it works is because of the idea I might as well do something there. Like, she's not repeating the word closet. It's just well constructed. The syntax is great. So this worked for me, even though it sort of verged on the cheeseball. There are so many different examples I'm going to read, but I'm just going to read 3 more. On 336, we have a beautiful simile. Here it is using the word like, and it was so evocative and really beautiful. This is when she is together with Southampton. There was a scattering of furniture covered with great white sheets billowing like the sails of ships that might carry the two of them away. The idea of carrying the two of them away is like a little bit cheeseball. I actually would have liked it just to end at the ships. And part of the reason why this works so well is you can really see these white sheets. You know why they're over the furniture. If you've read any historical fiction, this is a house that's kind of closed down for a certain amount of time. They've put sheets over things so they don't get dusty. And visually, they would be very close to sails. That's part of the reason why a metaphor or simile, a comparison like this works, is because it's close. So your reader's it's not like taking you too far out of it, but it is showing it in a new way. So you can imagine the billowing, because you can imagine sails, but the way that she is also evoking a sailing ship, it really anchors us in this time. Sailing ships are how they would have been getting around. And it also speaks to the idea of escape. It speaks to the idea of travel. It's really evoking a lot in a way that is really effective. But then up above we have this. They came together like an alchemical reaction, the kind that gets mistaken for sorcery because it alters form and substance. I was like, no, this is too much. So there's this idea in any MFA program, when you are writing about sex, she writes about sex really well. And what she does is the thing you're supposed to do, which is she just tells you what's happening. So, he's like resting his head on her chest, or he's like touching. There was a lot of tracing. I was like, we don't need so much like tracing stuff on, someone's arm, or tracing something on their back or whatever. A little bit too much tracing. But she does a very good job of just describing what's happening. And then at the end, we have this thing where they're coming together like an alchemical reaction. The word choice was a little funky, and then this idea of sorcery, and then the idea of altering form and substance. I was like, you've got the witch kind of thing, you've got this idea of alchemy. I don't know, it felt like too much, and also just not necessary. Like, we've already seen how they are coming together. We know they're very passionate. We don't need this whole somewhat overwrought description. There's one more I want to touch on. So the skill with which she was talking about the sail and those sailing ships really places us in the era, which is a very skillful way to use metaphor. But there are times, too, where it was a bit overwritten. So on page 90, we have this. As she undressed Hunsdon, she marked the way breath sawed in and out of him in meter, like verse. I was like, no. I mean, yes, she likes him well enough, but also, it's just like, I don't know, if you're with someone, I'm not sure that you would be thinking that their breath was like the meter of a poem. I think it also was a little funky to me that she said in meter, like verse. So meter, just as like iambic pentameter is an example of meter, or like Dr. Seuss, he only writes in anapestic tetrameter. Like, that's the meter of his language. But the idea of in meter, like verse, I was like, oh gosh, I don't want his breathing to be compared to poetry. It just is like too far away. And then also to kind of double down, it just was a bit too much. I should probably end on a positive one, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to say that overall, her use of figurative language is excellent. So before we close, I'm going to move just very quickly through my quibbles. One was that occasionally the narrative voice in the Amelia sections, it was like a little too close to Amelia's internal voice. Like, I found some inconsistencies in that I was sort of like, I don't think Amelia would be having these thoughts. It's sounding conspicuously like the narrator. And it's a very fine line, and it's a very subtle critique, but it was just something that I noticed. There was a short section where Queen Sophie of Denmark is speaking in French, and it was driving me crazy because you had the French, and then there would be a gloss where, she would attribute the French to someone, and then she would have the English translation in italics. And I was like, gosh, either put it in French that's kind of obvious enough from the dialogue and the context clues that you don't need to have the translation, or just say the words, say whatever the message is, and then you just say, she said in French. Like, it doesn't really matter to us that Queen Sophie is speaking in French. And it's very easy to just say at the top, like, she's speaking in French, or remind us as we are moving through that she's saying these things in French. I want to take a brief minute to look at some of these times where Picoult is in fact falling into that trap, which is when something in a novel is sort of too convenient. The two that I wanted to read, the more sort of egregious of them, are ones that were in the Melina part. They just felt a little more contrived, which again, like, this ends up looking at these sort of quibbles is a way that shows the strength of her historical fiction, because these things that were kind of a little contrived in my mind were actually in the front story in the 21st century. You'll see exactly what I mean when I read this to you. 3 years after arriving in New York City, Melina got a job as an usher at an off-Broadway house where Hamlet was running. As she watched the show night after night, she wondered how Shakespeare had known so much about Denmark. She asked her reference librarian friend, and a few days later got her answer. Unclear, because there was no record that Shakespeare had left England, much less visited the Danish court. So a couple things here. One is that I used to be like 10.6% Danish, and recently 23andMe like demoted my Danishness. I'm like 9.4%. Every time there's something that is set in Denmark, I loved in this book when as a young girl, when Amelia goes there. It wasn't even like heavy duty Denmark, but I was drawn to it. But here, I think you can see this. Like, if you have one paragraph where it's like, 3 years after New York, she happened to get a job as an usher, and it happened to be Shakespeare, and she happened to be thinking about the Danish part of Shakespeare. So to me, that feels contrived, partially because it's this quick little interlude, and then we have a reference librarian who's coming up with the answer, and the answer is really, moving the plot forward. It felt to me like this is like, Picoult has her do this thing, has her get this job. Most of Melina's life, in fact, feels very organic. And the things that, although I have to say, the whole like leaning on the father thing, I was a little like, I'm not sure we needed the whole like father situation. Also, whenever anybody's an only child, like she's an only child and Jasper's an only child, I always am a little like, I feel like writers are a little lazy. I'm like, okay, yeah, it's difficult to write about someone, and have birth order be a factor for your character. But whenever someone's an only child, I'm like, okay, this is just because they didn't want to get too messy. Also, I mean, I don't want to hear about Melina's siblings. Like, that's just not something I'm interested in. So, I mean, fair, but it's always a little conspicuous to me. But I would argue that it's certainly helping us appreciate how the rest of it, in fact, feels like it is growing organically. On page 93, in the Amelia section, there was one of these things that was like totally too convenient, but then it was about the Puritans, and I am so anti-puritanical. I'm just like, I feel like, well, these days our country has a lot more things wrong with it, but I always feel like the establishment of our country on these like puritanical beliefs is just so not great. That's maybe the Danish part of me. The Danish part of me is just like not so into like all that restriction and all that shame and all that rigidity. But so when the Puritans are mentioned, and it was so, I was like, oh my God, right. This would have been around the time when you really have them, at the beginning of the 17th century, in the early 1600s, you're going to have them like really fomenting all sorts of unrest. And in fact, you're going to have them leave. It's, right around the time that the Mayflower would have been setting sail. So we had this thing that felt kind of contrived, but I actually loved it. I was like, you know what, Jodi? Totally fine. You can have this kind of contrived digression about the Puritans because I'm really interested in what you have to say. There was another one like that much later in the book about childbirth that, again, I don't know if it was about statistics of childbirth or something, that I was like, oh gosh, this is not growing organically out of the story. But then I felt myself really being engaged with the actual information. So honestly, I mean, anytime there is a rule in literature or sort of a rule of thumb, if a writer can pull it off and I can stay engaged and I can feel good about whatever the thing was, then absolutely they can break that rule. The other example I want to look at is one of the Melina chapters. And this is a very specific thing that as an editor and a writer, it drives me absolutely insane when people do this. And if you have done, I did 3/4 of an MFA program at Bennington College. And, think what you want about MFA programs, but I loved it. In part because it sort of pulled back the curtain and really got to the bottom of like how writers can make kind of gnarly mistakes. And one of the sort of things you learn along the course of your MFA is that you should never put exposition in dialogue. So exposition is simply like background information. And most of the time, it should be delivered by your narrator. If you have a point when someone's like, hey, remember when we went to the movies last night and you fell down and blah, blah, blah. Like no one's ever going to say that to someone else because both parties remember that. And there were a couple of times where I felt like Jodi Picoult was putting a lot of exposition in dialogue, and I was like, oh gosh, no. Again, it served to show that most of the time she does not. But on page 167, we have this. This is Melina speaking. Did you know that the New York Public Libraries used to have apartments in them for the caretakers, Melina said. The one in here was 7 rooms. The guy who lived in it had once been a designer for Thomas Edison. The library made him move out in 1941 because they needed to renovate the space into a telephone switchboard and a smoking room. I mean, honestly, as I'm rereading that, I was like, that's totally charming. Like, I like learning that information, absolutely. But maybe it's the part at the top there when she's like, did you know? And this is also like a flirty moment between her and Jasper that, like, it kind of works, but I was like, no. And then a little further down, we have this. Did you know, Jasper says, that the library has over 4 million books, but also Charles Dickens' favorite letter opener, Jack Kerouac's Crutches, and a letter Columbus wrote in 1493 announcing that he'd discovered the New World? So this is like, I mean, like you can kind of imagine these two kind of brainy people who are interested in researching in the library. You can imagine them kind of one-upping each other. But for me, it just felt too much like Jodi Picoult was like, here's all this stuff that's really, truly interesting about the New York Public Library. And this was a time when I was like, wow, I actually am very happy to know all of this stuff, but I didn't want it sort of handed to me in that fashion. It just felt like she had learned this cool stuff and really wanted it in the novel. And so she sort of is like jamming it in, even though it's not growing out particularly organically. So any of you writers out there, do not put your exposition in dialogue. I talked already about the things that were too convenient. I also, oh my gosh, for the longest time now, I don't know, 15 years, I am so bothered by the adverb impossibly. And any literary fiction, like any fiction that purports to be literary fiction, and actually some like very challenging, very astute, like really, really good literary fiction, I'll come across the word impossibly. And every single time I'm like, no, like I literally will write in my marginalia, I'll be like, no, with like 15 O's, because it never adds. It's always like she was impossibly tall, or, you know, it was impossibly cold. I'm like, no, it doesn't, it's not impossibly cold. She's not impossibly tall. She's tall. So I did come across it, and it's always just once in whatever work it is that I'm reading, and I always have to circle it. And when I got to it in this novel, I was a little like, oh God, there it is. And I was like, no. But I also was like, okay, this is like, you know, in some weird way, it sort of puts it into this class of literary fiction where these very like brainy people who are writing very quality prose kind of slip into this weird thing where somebody was impossibly handsome or whatever. I'm not going to look too closely at the idea of these parts that were a little cheeseball. And the one example I do want to look at, I mean, you know what this is. It's like, and oftentimes I just am like, just take that out. Like, I think we could just omit that whole paragraph. There is another pointer that they give you in MFA programs are not like giving you pointers, but one of the pieces of advice is that often writers will write something and it's very strong, and then they'll have a paragraph at the end because of human nature that kind of recaps the whole thing, or like tries to say it with a metaphor. And that often, if you are a writer, it's a good idea to just eliminate that last paragraph, or certainly the last sentence, and just see if the writing stands on its own. And I cannot tell you as an editor how many times I've just been like, nope, because it's the work is so strong, and then you have this like explanatory sentence, or this like gilding the lily sentence at the end. It's almost like the writer isn't giving the reader enough credit. It's like, we figured it out. We don't need you to sort of spell it out for us. And here on page 136, we have an example of that kind of thing. This is when Amelia is with Southampton. "You are well?" he whispered. "I am." Amelia blinked up at the night sky. Even with her vast poet's vocabulary, she could not find a single word to describe how she felt. It was joy that couldn't be contained in a string of alphabet. It was fear of what was yet to come. "I am." She realized, smiling, that this was a complete sentence, an answer in and of itself. So it may be a little hard to follow along, but he's like, "Are you well?" And she's like, "I am." And she's going to say something else, and she can't figure out the words. And then she says, "I am." And that's all she needed. That's the answer unto itself. And I was a little like, I am, like, I don't know. It just seemed like a little pat. Like, this is someone who is in the process of becoming lots of things. And I guess you could argue that she's kind of like her truest self when she is with her lover. But I just maybe didn't need it spelled out in quite that way. And I think you can also argue that in a book that's very romantic, that really has to do with passion and romance, that you can sort of verge into these things that feel a little bit cheeseball and a little sort of overly romanticized. And there's not a lot of it, but it is something that I noted throughout. So the last thing I want to talk about in terms of a quibble, very briefly, but this is a much larger problem, which is I did not buy the Jasper character. So this was a character, unlike like all of the characters in the book, the minor and the principal characters. They were so clear to me, even the ones that we didn't see for very long. I loved the character of Bess. I mean, it just was so well done in almost all of the cases. But Jasper, for some reason, I could not get a hold of him. In the beginning, when he's such a dick to her at the reading of her play when she's in college and he's 10 years older, I don't know. I got a sense of him that was so kind of repellent and so like persnickety that I was like, he seemed so different from her and really just like kind of just like not a great person. And so then later, when there is sexual chemistry between the two of them, I was like, wait, what? Like it just didn't gel. I didn't really believe that the chemistry was evolving. And part of that was the excellent characterization of Melina. I mean, she seems like someone who's not very interested in aesthetics and someone who has a lot of principles and someone who's working really hard. And then you have kind of persnickety Jasper who's like suddenly like so taken by her. I just didn't quite buy it. And then with the character of Jasper, as we were moving toward the end, there was more sort of development of who he was. And there were things like at one point someone says, we want to pick your brain. And he's startled because he takes it that they actually want to pick at his brain, like in some sort of like not medical, but like, you know, gross, gory way. And I was like, what? No, I just didn't really buy it. And you could, and there were different times when he was like, I take things too literally, but it didn't gel for me. And I can imagine if you're a reader and you loved her and you loved the character of Jasper, you could say, well, that's because, you know, he's this type of person and that type of person. And you know, if he worked for you, then that is amazing and great. And in a novel where you have so many characters, there is a real danger that they're not all going to be developed perfectly. But that was kind of an important one to develop. And I just didn't buy it. I didn't buy their chemistry. And I just couldn't get a handle on him as a person. Happily, I think when I look back at this work, I'm going to think mostly about the Amelia stuff. Actually, I loved the Andre character too. So, you know, I'm going to remember bits and pieces of it. Mostly, I think I'm going to remember the fact that there was this woman, Amelia Bassano, which is an excellent, excellent way to wrap up the lecture. There are lots of appendices at the back. I really enjoyed reading the part about Amelia and what we know about her life and the picture of her miniature. I like the fact that, you know, thanks to Jodi Picoult, there's like some sort of question now, and they're research librarians who are trying to see if Southampton and Amelia really like did know each other. And it's sort of this nice historical / literary sleuthing that is now going on thanks to our author. But I really thought the novel did such a good job of bringing this person to life and not only giving us this look at what was happening in Elizabethan England, but also really showing all the ways that we haven't come quite as far as we wish. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm so happy to dive into this book with you because I think she really delivers on a premise that was pretty ambitious. And I hope that this deep dive helped you appreciate a little more why the book works so well, and also why Jodi Picoult in general is such a strong writer. So thank you for tuning in. Happy reading!